Good morning. Today we are discussing physiology of physical activity. This chapter is massive, and it is a lot to unpack. This chapter is probably the most relevant for everything that I do on a regular basis with regards to coaching track and field, coaching, whatever athletes I have, and to coaching in the gym. Um, this chapter is also an incredible amount of information. I would say that, this chapter itself is pretty much, if you guys are in exercise science, an entire semester's worth of exercise physiology. So what you'll see is it'll look like I'm bouncing around a lot, and that's because I am. There's a lot of information within this chapter. I'm going to try to give you guys some examples of some of the aspects of laboratory work and why we use laboratory work to continue our evidence-based practice. But it's a lot, and you're expected to read the chapter and know a lot about these metrics with which we measure, for which we measure. Right. So first, let's understand what exercise physiologists do and how they might differ per se from a biomechanist, right? Well, what are some things that we would do as an exercise physiologist? Well, help athletes perform. You know, what we have in this real world are questions, right? And within the research community, the research side of things, we try to answer these questions, right? So how can I make the fastest sprinter in the world, right? Maybe, I have to improve their muscle fiber composition, right? Maybe that actually produced a faster sprinter. Um, maybe you're looking at improving fitness, in improving physical fitness and safety, right? So you have to be careful on how you're performing these things. A 15-year-old with no exercise history versus a 55-year-old with early onset osteoporosis and having a knee replacement, right? Um, and then, conducting the research, right? So some other questions, right? So these are just some possible research scenarios of things that have been done, right? The optimal dietary composition for triathletes. This was my master's thesis, right? So I compared a low carbohydrate diet to a high carbohydrate diet in triathletes after a 10-week protocol and looked at performance metrics. The whole theory that I was looking to test was that some people believe that low carbohydrate diet might be superior for triathletes and endurance athletes. And I addressed this question. Um, Other things, college football players' dietary habits. I've read a research study which showed that because of the dietary habits of football players at a university where a lot of students, you guys are all students, so you guys can probably relate to this. A lot of students just simply skip out on breakfast. Maybe they have a small, bar or something. They'll have like an average or small size lunch, and then at least as far as football players go, right? They go to practice in the afternoon, and then they gorge themselves with, something between like 2,000 to 3,000, 3,500 calories in one meal. And I read research which showed, when you're controlling for having uh, a balanced diet throughout the day, so like 4 or 5 meals throughout the day, morning, snack, lunch, dinner, versus having the majority of your calories in the afternoon. Football players' body composition actually worsened, where the football players with that balanced diet throughout the day, right, maintained their muscle much more than those people that had the massive meal in the afternoon, right? So these researchers addressed a question of dietary habits, right, in college football players. Average total daily energy expenditure in obese males working construction. This was just a hypothetical one I threw out, right? We always say that, if you're very active, maybe you can eat more. Well, maybe not. Maybe your EPOC isn't as high, right? Again, these are just questions and scenarios that are constantly brought up in the research community, and it's kind of cool because you get to answer them. So, skipping this, let's just go to, what we try to do is we try as exercise physiologists to understand acute, i.e. the short term or immediate, and chronic, the long term biological adaptations to training, right? So what will, if I go to the gym 3 times a week, what will that do to my body composition? Am I going to, if I lift weights 3 times a week, is that going to raise my body, raise my body fat? Is that going to lower my body fat? And to what extent on each side? And we can quantify these things. And that is what we do. We quantify. Um, we're going to talk a little bit about assessment later on, and we'll talk a little bit about the qualitative versus quantitative side of things. Right? But these biological adaptations can be a lot of different things, and that's why I said this chapter is a lot. You could be looking at metabolic things. Well, what does it do to metabolism? Right? What does it do to their total daily energy expenditure? What does it do to their EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption? They could be hormonal. What does resistance training do to testosterone levels, to human growth hormone? It could be bioenergetic. By exercising at a certain intensity, what energy system are you using, right? Are you using more your oxidative system or your phosphocreatine system? It could be mechanical, it could be structural. What you'll see is there is a tremendous amount of areas that can be researched within exercise physiology. But before we jump into what it is we do, we talk a little bit about careers first because, like I said, that is a major portion of this class. So exercise physiology is, and exercise science is a little difficult career-wise, okay? So, and I say that because it is hard within this community to have just an exercise science degree, okay? If you have an exercise science degree, usually you need a little bit more to land careers. For instance, university faculty. To be a tenured track professor, typically you need a doctoral degree of some sort to land a tenure track position. To conduct research, usually we're looking for people that has some sort of master's degree. So hospitals, if you want to work as a cardiac rehab, pulmonary rehab in those settings, once again, more often you need a master's degree. It is possible, and that falls along with research centers. It is possible that some people with just an undergraduate degree with additional certifications, like ACSM has a certified exercise physiologist certification, that you can take that and work in a pulmonary rehab setting. That's possible for sure, but again, it's definitely harder, and usually you need something higher than just an undergraduate degree. Now, going down the line, as a personal trainer in corporate fitness, you actually don't need a degree at all, right? But an exercise science degree can help you within those careers once you get some type of training certification, right? So those are a little bit lower down the barrel, which you see later on in the book, in the later chapters. Most important is having a plan of what you're doing, okay? Have a plan, when you guys are all in this class somewhere between 18, 22, 23, 24 usually, and it's important to start developing a plan with this degree. If you're finishing here with a degree in exercise science and you have no idea what you want to do, well, it's not the end of the world, right? It's going to help you a lot more to start to have some sort of plan. Even if you're not sure, at least you're having some direction or goal to funnel you in the right direction. If you change your mind, that's not a big deal. Otherwise, you're going to end up finishing this exercise science degree and have no idea where to go from there. Right. So let's talk about research methods. Um, Before we even go into that, we have to understand a little bit about qualitative versus quantitative. And I spoke about this during our psychology slides, right? Qualitative versus quantitative. So sports psychology tends to be measured in much more qualitative metrics, right? We spoke to questionnaires, we spoke to surveys, We spoke to interviews. Those are much more qualitative metrics. On the other hand, in exercise physiology, we are much more quantitative and numbers oriented. How much does somebody bench press? That's a number, right? How much do they improve on their 40-meter dash? That is a number. How much body weight did they lose, right? And we tend to analyze these things statistically. And that is pretty much what all of these tests are, right? So you've got, the metabolic cart, right? So a metabolic cart is what measures gas exchange as you are breathing into a mask. So you put a mask on and it measures what you're expelling. And typically what that does is they measure the amount of O2 expelled compared to the amount of CO2 expelled. And they can, by doing that, they can calculate how much carbohydrates you're burning or utilizing, right, for energy versus how much fat you are utilizing for energy. The metabolic cart is a great tool for assessing daily energy expenditure. I just ran a resting metabolic rate about a week and a half ago, right? So it measures how much energy you're burning. So like me, for instance, to do resting metabolic rate, I showed up the day of the test. I did standard protocols where I rested for about 20 minutes, put the mask on, and I just sat and I rested. And it just measured my gas expenditure and it measured how much I was burning. And what it was able to tell me, because the computer has a pretty cool formula to calculate this, how much calories I was burning throughout the day on average if I did nothing. And my resting metabolic rate was about 1450 to 1500 calories. So again, that's like a pretty cool assessment to see like, okay, well, we've got a male, very active, works out 4 times a week, and see what his resting metabolic rate is. Well, let's compare that to, let's say, a sedentary female and see what their like maybe like a 50-year-old sedentary female, because we know that energy expenditure declines with age, right? Let's see what their resting metabolic rate is. That's how you could address certain questions. Me specifically with regards to the metabolic cart, I'm addressing a personal question, right? So I'm not doing some peer-reviewed research. I'm addressing a question of, I want to see the effect that weight loss has on resting metabolic rate. So what some of you may know is that resting metabolic rate, right, is a function of your organs and what they have to do, but another function of maintenance is within your muscle tissue. So some people have this theory that your resting metabolic rate is going to decrease as you lose weight. Especially it's going to decrease a lot if you lose a lot of weight, and that's one of the reasons why people put weight back on, right? So I'm trying to look at, I measured my resting metabolic rate. Now I'm going to go through a weight loss period. I'm going to probably lose somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds. And I'm going to see if my resting metabolic rate has decreased significantly. Like in this case, I don't know, is my resting metabolic rate going to drop to 1,000 calories per day, 1,100 calories per day? Or is it going to drop to like 1,400 or 1,350, which isn't a tremendous amount of a difference, right? Cycle ergometers, arm ergometers, or treadmills, right? These are used to do different tests, typically a VO2 max test, which we talk about later. An echocardiogram is usually used to assess cardiac function. Hydrostatic underwater weigh-in, DEXA, skin fold calipers, bioelectric impedance. So those was that 4 things I just listed? Those are all used to assess body composition. So if you guys have a minute, what I did, this link right below, is a video of a guy who owns a gym called Untamed Strength. His name is Alan Thrall. And what he did was he went through, I want to say, about 6 ways to assess body composition. There are multiple ways to assess certain metrics, right? In this case, body fat percentage, right? So he did a hydrostatic weigh-in, he did a DEXA, he did skin fold calipers, he did BIA, and he even had professionals assess his body fat composition, right? And in the video, it's kind of cool because it shows you that not all tests are the same, right? So not all tests are the same in that they are not all reliable and that they measure, or excuse me, valid. What they measure, they measure what they say they are going to measure. So for an example, the bioelectric impedance, I believe his number was something like maybe 24 or 25% body fat. But on a DEXA, it might have been something much less. I think it was something like 18% body fat. So you could see, if you can't always compare metrics between different tools. Let me say that again. You cannot always compare the same metric between tools because there's a degree of variability, right? So you can't compare, even though they say they're measuring the same thing, right? BIA and skin fold calipers are measuring body fat composition, or excuse me, body fat percentage, right? But you can't say, oh, this week you can't measure body fat percentage one week on BIA and then the next week on skin fold calipers and compare those two numbers because they're going to be slightly different, right? So you have to be careful with instrumentation, make sure there's some sort of consistency, right? And that's simply what that video is showing. It's a fun little video. Um, let's move on. Research methods. So why study exercise physiology in a lab, right? Why would we do that? Well, I mean, we study exercise physiology in a lab because we can help increase our control within our study. We can control variables, right, that you can't control in the real world. So, like an example would be in a study, we can give somebody an exact warm-up protocol by watching them, right, within the lab. Or on a treadmill, we can give them the exact pace we want them to run. If you were on a track, right, while you may want them to run a pace, they might deviate from that. So it improves the control, which in turn improves the reliability of the results, right? The results are much more meaningful, right? So are there limitations to research in a lab? The answer is absolutely, right? The limitations are very obvious. If you're trying to study, let's say vertical jump performance, right? And we just do a vertical jump, we test how high they jump. Is that going to carry over directly to vertical jump within a basketball game? Like, oh, this guy should be getting every single rebound because he got 43-inch vertical. No, not necessarily. There's a lot of other extraneous factors in the real world that we cannot account for within the lab. Okay, so there's not always a direct carryover to the real world based on laboratory results. Why would we use animals in research? Research sometimes can be difficult, right? A lot of research can be difficult to get what we would call IRB approval. IRB is Institutional Review Board. And every college has an IRB where they have to approve your research to make sure that it is ethical to be conducted. And sometimes if research that might be deemed unethical to be conducted on humans may be conducted on animals first to prove safety. Are there limitations? Absolutely, those are obvious. Sometimes you can't, while animals like rats, right, or mice, while they are fairly close in genetic sequencing to humans, right, it's very obvious that you can't directly make comparisons. If you're comparing a fast twitch muscle fiber in a mouse, it's not necessarily it's obviously not a apples to apples comparison. So sometimes, when we're in a laboratory, like I said, things don't carry over. Sometimes there's instrumentation errors. So sometimes what we try to do is we try to do actual field work, which is research in the field, right? So some examples of equipment that we might use or tests that we might use are the pacer or beep test. So if you guys, remember probably in high school, maybe middle school, you guys conducted the beep test where you ran from one side, right? And then 20 meters on the other side was a cone. You ran there, you had to get to that before the beep went off. And then it beeped again, and you run back. And then it beeped again, you ran back. That's called the pacer or the beep test. And that's an assessment of aerobic capacity, right? It's an assessment of VO2 max. We've got formulas to directly correlate that to VO2. Would that be better than a VO2 max test done on a treadmill? Maybe. I mean, you're actually running 20 meters versus being on a treadmill. You're actually outside, so maybe that might be more accurate in some cases. And then we've got other things. We've got other tools like heart rate monitors and pedometers, which we can use in the field instead of, again, being stuck in a laboratory. Okay, we're moving on to muscle fiber typing, muscle fiber type. So what you guys should know about skeletal muscle is that we've got primarily two fiber types, slow twitch, fast twitch, right? Our fast twitch are called type 2 fibers. Our slow twitch are type 1 fibers. The problem, these fibers themselves, right, are what are used to produce a contraction, which in turn produces human movement, right? Our skeletal muscle, right, is what produces human movement, right? The fibers in the muscle pull on the tendon, which in turn pull on the bone, and that's what causes movement, right? So these fibers, right, are composed of myofibrils, right? These contractile components, these myofibrils, are called actin and myosin, right? Again, you guys will go deeper into this if you take exercise physiology, where it'll give you guys a little bit of more information on how to distinguish between the actin and myosin, so on and so forth. But from a larger, more overarching standpoint, we've got type 2 and type 1, right? So your fast twitch fibers are primarily used for your explosive movements, right? Jumping, sprinting. Your slow twitch fibers, or type 1 fibers, are used primarily for your endurance-oriented movements. So repeated submaximal contractions. What's an example of repeated submaximal contractions? Oh, well, maybe running 5 miles, right? You know, sometimes people kind of forget, well, our muscles are still contracting when we're running, 5 miles, even if we're running slow, right? Your gastroc, your soleus, your quads, they're all still contracting, but just repeatedly at these submaximal intensities, okay? And then I forget if the text talks about it, but what we have to realize is that they're not purely type 1 and type 2 fibers. There's some fibers in between. So muscle fiber type exists on a continuum, right? And this can be a little confusing, but it's based on their oxidative properties, okay? So slow twitch or type 1 fibers tend to be more oxidative, which is what gives them that ability to be more fatigue resistant. Fast twitch muscle fibers, right, are a little less oxidative, so they're a little bit more fatigable, right? And that's why, explosive movements, we can't repeatedly do them, right? They're not these fatigue resistant fibers, or we can't do them repeatedly. We just get tired. All right, so resistance training, right? So we've got some goals in resistance training. One goal is to look at or to improve maximum muscular strength. Okay, and what is muscular maximum strength? We measure it as the maximum amount of force a muscle fiber can produce. All right, this should not be confused with maximum power. Right, so maximum strength is maximum force. Power is force times velocity. So it's force based on a given speed, a high speed, I should say, right? We want a high amount of force and a high amount of velocity for maximum power. Maximum strength does not look at speed at all, and maximum strength is typically assessed at slightly slower velocities than maximum power. Muscular endurance is the ability to produce force over a specific duration, like I said, at sub-maximal intensities. That's muscular endurance. Now, when we are producing movement, whether it's running, whether it's swimming, whether it's lifting weights, right, we have these certain types of contraction. Most notably and most thought of are eccentric versus concentric. So eccentric, right, if we have our actin and myosin, right, don't worry about it too much, but say one arm is actin, one arm is myosin. Eccentric is the lengthening of your muscle fibers. Typically, we can think of eccentric as the lowering phase of a certain movement, right? So in this case, if I'm doing a dumbbell curl, lowering the dumbbell is the lengthening of the fibers of my bicep, right? And that is the eccentric component. As I contract up, my fibers are shortening, right? They're shortening, and that is the concentric component. So eccentric, concentric. If I was squatting, right? If I was to stand up in here and squat, right? Lowering is eccentric, right? As I push up out of the squat, I am doing the concentric portion, right? Isometric is slightly different than the other two. Isometric is exerting an equal amount of force, right? Against an object. So it would be basically pressing up against something that is, because remember Newton's laws, for every, well, we didn't go over them, but for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. So as we're pressing up against something and our muscle fiber, the length is not changing, right, but we're pressing up at maximal intensity, right, that's an isometric. If our muscle is not changing length while we do a movement, that's isometric. All right, so how do we measure force? Well, there's 3 ways to measure force, and this can be a little confusing, right? We could measure force isometrically, isotonically, and isokinetically, right? So isometric is just what I said. The muscle does not change length. So an example of an isometric, right, would be pushing up against a wall at maximal force because the wall's not going to move, right? So again, if we're pushing up against the wall, it's not moving. Our muscles aren't lengthening or they are not shortening. They're staying the same. That's isometric force, but we could still measure the force of, if we had some type of force plate on the wall. Isotonic, right, is the same amount of resistive force while moving it. So isotonic would be like lifting a free weight, right? So I say pushing up against the wall is isometric because the force can change. You can push a wall up against a wall lightly. You can push a little harder. You can push a little harder, and you're actually producing more force as you push up against the wall. That's isometric. Isotonic is when the resistance stays exactly the same, right? The easiest example is if I put 135 pounds on a bench press or 135 pounds on a bar for squat, right? The resistance is the same exactly, the resistance is the same throughout the entire movement. It's not changing, right? Isokinetic is the same speed throughout a movement. So we would have to use this usually using an isokinetic dynamometer, right? So it dictates the speed that has to be done through a movement. So if we're using the squat example, there's certain times, if we're squatting, we can descend maybe a little faster, and ascension might be a little bit slower because it's harder to squat the weight up. Whatever, it's just an example. An isokinetic dynamometer moves the resistance at an exact speed for you. Okay, well, it determines that you have to move at a certain speed, I should say. Okay, so now again, this is so much information, right? Strength. Well, there's 2 primary factors for strength. Muscle size, right? And the neuromuscular, right, which is the brain, right? Size is primarily measured via hypertrophy, right? And hypertrophy means to increase the size of the muscle fiber. Now there's various subcomponents of muscle hypertrophy like sarcoplasmic, but you guys don't have to worry too much about that at all, I should say. You just need to know that hypertrophy is an increase in the muscle fiber size. And how do we increase the muscle fiber size? By lifting weights, by providing some sort of resistance, and our body in turn produces some sort of adaptation which adds muscle fibers. Right? Another component of strength is the neurological factor. Right? So the neurological factor is the efficiency and the adaptation that somebody goes through when they get used to something. You could look at it as like practice if you want, right? So rate coding, we have to recruit muscle fibers, right? And we have to recruit them in what we call a size order. So our smallest muscle fibers are recruited first, then the slightly larger ones, then the larger ones, right? Rate coding is a more efficient recruitment of those fibers, Rate of force development, right? So we have to send this neurological signal from our brain, right, all the way down to the bicep, which says, hey, we want to do a curl, right? As through practice, we can learn how to do this faster, right? Our brain sends that signal faster. And then the synchronization of agonist and antagonist. Typically, when we're doing movements, the agonist muscle is the primary mover, right? The antagonist, right, is usually something that we don't want to use, right? So an example on the bench press is an agonist would be obviously the pectorals, but another agonist muscle would be the triceps, which helps lock out the bench press. The antagonist to the triceps would be the biceps, right? So we can improve this synchronization of when the triceps are contracting and when the biceps would be relaxing during a bench press. And that's all done through practice. Typically, newbie gains in strength. So when people start working out, even, you could even compare this to sprinting, right? Improvements in force production are typically because of neural factors, not hypertrophy or structure, right? We don't add muscle overnight, but what you will see, like in a week, you're not going to add a lot of muscle, but in a week, somebody can actually get stronger because of neurological reasons. All right, cardiovascular. I'm going to move a little quicker. So again, you guys have to know all these. Cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped per minute, right, out of the heart. Okay. We measure this, right, where Q, right, which equals cardiac output, is the heart rate per minute, how many times your heart beats per minute, times the amount of blood pumped per beat. Right, so that's what cardiac output is. Okay, so in training, right, low intensities, the increase in cardiac output is primarily from an increase in stroke volume. All right, so let me repeat that. Right, our cardiac output is the amount of blood pumped per minute. So how do we increase that? We can either increase the amount of blood we pump per beat, or we can increase the force, right? Not the force, excuse me, the amount of times we beat. Okay, so at very low intensities, right, the amount of blood we pump is primarily determined from an increase in the amount of blood pumped per beat, not a raise in your actual heart rate. Once intensity increases, typically this is around 40% of a VO2 max, right? Heart rate becomes the primary reason why we actually pump more blood per minute, just because our heart is just beating a lot faster, right? We go from, a resting heart rate of about, let's say 70, 80 beats per minute. As we start to exercise a little bit, that can go to 100, to 110, to 120. If your heart at resting is a 70 beats per minute, and then all of a sudden it goes up to 140 beats per minute, right? It's literally doubled, right, the beats per minute, which should maybe not necessarily double the amounts, but it'll come pretty damn close to doubling the amount of blood pumps per minute just because there's so many more beats. Cardiovascular adaptations include an increase in VO2 max, right? An increase in stroke volume. What typically happens is, again, stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped per beat. What happens is, as you start to a chronic adaptation, right, is that our heart actually gets thicker, right? And if our heart walls, the walls in our heart actually get thicker, it can stretch more. And if it can stretch more, like a rubber band, it can produce more force, and in this case, pump more blood, right? So that's an increase in stroke volume, an increase in capillary density to increase an exchange. Right? That's another an increased blood exchange. That's another adaptation to endurance training.